Hey folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from the Embellish Pod. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully it can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com and I'll try to get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or TikTok with the exact same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and even some cocktail development articles that I've been writing. I'm leveraging Substack for those things now, so if you could kind of give that a visit. Today, I have Zach Johnston joining me from Blackwood. He's got a really interesting backstory that kind of brought him to that particular company. I hope you guys enjoy the conversation, and I think we probably have enough that we're going to have to do this again soon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be consuming this particular episode. Today, I have Zach Johnston joining me, and I'll give Zach a chance to sort of introduce himself and kind of how he got here. I met / was introduced to Zach several years ago whenever he was still working in a journalism situation, and now he's kind of moved on from that. And you've got a really kind of a unique path. But more recently, I've been listening to you a lot on a Film and Whiskey podcast because I love those guys. I consider them to be friends, and so I listen to you guys speak. And my first question, we're going to get a chance to introduce you, but you use the word cinema a lot, and I need to know, do you view going to the movies and going to cinema as different things, or is it just an interchangeable term for you? Like, is there a quality standard or something?
I generally want to say it's interchangeable. I think I lived abroad for about 22-ish years, 21 years. And generally speaking, abroad, they're all cinemas, not movie theaters. So it just sort of got ingrained after a while. Saying you're going to the theater, like it means you're going to see a play or a musical in most other places. And so you just say you're going to the cinema. That said, if I wanted to be like really, hoity-toity, to me, there is a difference between like cinematic art and movies. Mm-hmm. There's films that are people make that are pieces of art that are probably cinema, if you want to get really technical. And then there are, popcorn flicks that are just pure pop entertainment, right? And they both have equal value. And that's why I think it's really, for me, interchangeable.
Yeah. Perfect. And that's sort of what I suspected the answer to be. And honestly, you teed up a really good point of introduction there, right? So kind of tell us who you are and how you got to where you are. You mentioned you lived abroad for 20 some odd years. You've been here for a while too. Like, how do you get to where you are?
Time, man. It just keeps ticking on. So I'm Zach Johnston. I'm the basically the chief brand officer, international sales guy for Blackwood Distilling Company here in Kentucky. Path into spirits has been long. Started with a trip to Dublin in 2000 when I went basically for spring break and to go to St. Patrick's Day. And it happened to be about when Jameson returned to Dublin for the first time in decades, and they'd reopened their Bow Street experience. And so I got into Irish whiskey pretty deeply then. I mean, this is also when I was in college. So, I was going down to Tenley Liquor in Northwest DC and getting handles of Austin Nichols Wild Turkey for $9.99, things like that. And then about 4 years later, 5 years later, maybe, my father-in-law took us on a trip to Edinburgh because he's a big Scotch guy, a big Talisker guy. And so we went to Scotland and I got sort of introduced to Scotch correctly. And, he introduced me to Talisker. Like, I still to this day remember going to the bar while we were waiting for my mother-in-law and wife to get ready to go, and him buying me my first Talisker 10 and explaining it to me and walking me through it and really, helping me fall in love with Scotch whiskey. Fast forward a couple years, I'm in Los Angeles in film school, and my best friend there basically ran or was the manager of Vendome Liquor on Riverside in Gohanga, which is a very famous liquor store for Studio City and all the studios. He ran all the tastings, and on the weekends, he'd bring home the half-empty bottles because they were opened, and we'd sit in his backyard and play cribbage and guitar and grill steaks, and he introduced me to bourbon. And, he sort of gave me this foundation in '07 of Jim Beam and Turkey are all perfectly fine whiskeys. But, this is what the people who make those whiskeys really love. And this is their passion project. So we were drinking, Red Maple Hill and Eight Cheers and all those bottles that are impossible to find now. We were just drinking them like they were Jim Beam white label. And now when we meet up, we joke that, basically pissed away $20,000 a weekend every time we cleared off those bottles. But it really gave me a sense of the passion behind the whiskey making process as opposed to just the sort of macro of it all. And then around, I want to say 2014 or so, I started working in the high-end cocktail bar scene in Berlin. I was extremely lucky. I got a job at Victoria Bar, which is sort of like the iconic cocktail bar, Galt Malo, all that stuff. And the owners, Stefan Weber and Beate Hindemann, who wrote The Art of Sophisticated Drinking, they took me under their wing because I'd worked in, organic wine bars in Prague, and I'd been in the service industry my whole life, basically. Like I worked in restaurants and sandwich bars to get myself through college and et cetera. Mother owned like luncheonettes when I was growing up. So I've always been in the service industry. So I always was able to sort of work those jobs very quickly, learn quickly. And they took me under their wing at Victoria Bar and really gave me a good foundation in both pairing spirits and cocktails with food, but also just the way the business works. And Beate Hindemann, she works a lot with Havana Club and does stuff in Cuba with the competition there, and spreading cocktail culture between the Spanish-speaking world and the German and English-speaking world. Stefan Weber, is an iconic bar owner, and he sort of trusted me enough to, give me a lot of valuable information. And so I got to a crossroads around 2015, 2016, where it was like, either I'm going to manage and open my own bar, and that's going to be my life, and that will be the sort of path, or I needed to parlay all those years of education basically into something that was a little more feasible for a person with small children who didn't want to work from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. every day and, not really have a daytime life with small kids. And so I chose the latter path and got into media. Luckily, Uproxx.com was fairly big at the time. This was sort of peak internet media, and they expanded a lifestyle section at the exact time I was looking to get out of bartending and into a more daytime focused job. So, Steve Bermucci was the managing editor, and he took a chance on me, and, he, along with Jarrett Meyer, the publisher, and Brett, the editor-in-chief, they really helped me become a media sort of cornerstone, if you will. And, it was food, travel, and drink in the beginning. I did a lot of beer, did a lot of wine, did a lot of travel stuff, did a lot of food stuff, recipes, competitions, just blah, blah, blah. But then around 2019, I was like, hey guys, we can really focus in on whiskey here and have a one-stop shop for whiskey reviews. Because at the time, a lot of the whiskey reviews in the mainstream, I'm not talking Breaking Bourbon or the niche stuff, were just reposting press releases, and that's it. And, so you'd go to Forbes, or you'd go to Men's Journal, or you'd go to Food and Wine, and it was just the press release regurgitated. And that's fine, but there wasn't, Uproxx was a juggernaut. We were getting, our ComScore was right up there with literally Facebook and Google. But anyway, started focusing on whiskey in 2019, which was fortuitous timing looking back. I started judging in San Francisco, IWSC, John Barleycorn. And basically, I flipped the script where 95% of what I did was just whiskey reviews. And the difference is we, as opposed to taking the press release and just putting those tasting notes in there, we made a pack that I had to taste the whiskey and do my own tasting notes and give you a bottom line of what is this good for? Who is it for? Sort of thing, as opposed to, hey, I like it or I don't. Less subjectivity and more objectivity of this might not be for me, but you might love it, sort of thing, and, this is perfectly good for cocktails. And if you want to sip and eat, to each their own, but I would put it in a cocktail, but that doesn't mean you need to, and just sort of being follow your own path and your own heart, because all our palates are different. And, it was very successful. And, by the time I left, I was getting obscene amount of views and reads and actual individual clicks as opposed to just page clicks. And, about 2024, Blackwood came calling, and they're like, hey, we'd had a relationship already for 3-4 years. And they were like, we want to expand out of Kentucky. At the time, Blackwood was Kentucky only. And do you want to come on board and help us do that expansion? Given that I had spent, 20 years abroad, I had, deep ties to importers, exporters, bars, restaurants, et cetera, for damn near 2 decades. And so it just felt right. It was the right time. Uproxx was about to shift more towards what they're doing now, which is, the creative space of big events with music and, focusing more in on music and things like that, which is perfectly great. So it was kind of perfect timing. And, over the last 2 years it's basically 2 years, this month, that I've been with Blackwood, we've gone from Kentucky. Now we're in DC, Texas, Florida, California, Nevada, Wyoming, Tennessee. We're about to expand Colorado, Washington. We just are about to launch in Australia. We're about to launch in Germany, France, and Denmark. And we're, looking at, Korea and Singapore next, and sort of just, taking a very small niche luxury whiskey product and finding the right places for it and kind of just getting good whiskey in people's glasses.
I love talking to people who have a background in storytelling, because you compartmentalize 30 years worth of life into 9 minutes in a really appropriate way, right? You didn't meander. You covered there's at least 3 pages worth of notes of things that we could move into next based off of that one answer. And I love that. Thank you so much for it.
Absolutely.
I'll probably go backwards just a little bit, right? So
Sure.
we'll look at, you spend a lot of time in a lot of really unique and really important hospitality places, whether it be your organic wine bars, your cocktail bars, the places that you were involved in, and then kind of growing up around that effectively. You went from film school into service industry, into writing about it, and then into making and selling it. And if I want to know how we get there, are there things, I guess maybe what are the things that you got from maybe that first phase that you couldn't get any other way whenever you're going to go build a whiskey brand into a international kind of setup?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's being observant, right? Like when I was 6 years old and sorting out buns and bread in my mom and grandmother's, cafe, it's just sort of like seeing how it's already done and just doing it that way without having to ask, right? And I sort of carried that with me when I was working at Two Amy's, which is a famous pizzeria in DC, where, I was on the first staff that sort of opened that place up with some fairly famous chefs back in 2000, I think it was. And it's also, and I learned there just like being observant and then internalizing what's already happening. If you can adjust something to make it more efficient, prove it. If not, follow what's already there, right? And that sort of has been my POV going through every aspect of work that I've done, especially in the service side of things. And I think that's what helped me at Victoria Bar and when I worked at Rum Trader and places like that in Berlin, was that I could observe what they were doing and I could ensure that I would do it the way they found to be the best way without having to be told or without having to ask. And then also just refining things to make it a little bit easier and a little cleaner where I could. And that could be anywhere from, speeding up how I cut limes just to do it a bit more efficiently and have it done quickly to, this is a really random example, but at Victoria Bar, we put our bar towels on top of the coffee machine because the steam would dry them. Mm-hmm. Or the warmth would dry them. But the waiters tend to just throw them on there. And so because I was at that end of the bar, I would always make sure everything was folded so it would dry evenly and just dry faster. And just little stuff like that I learned from growing up in restaurants. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And it's, I think that's and that then honestly, that applies to any job, right? Where it's all about what you can observe, follow, and improve upon without making noise. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it completely does. And it sounds like, you're at a young age applying effectively what is a reporter's eye to a thing, right? Because you're kind of observing. You add a little more to it because you're imagining a way to make the process better. I can't imagine too many journalists who maybe don't have that in the back of their mind. But if you think about, if I think about the film school version of Zach, and then there's the hospitality version of Zach, did either one of those ever think that journalism Zach was going to be a thing, or did it just, did it just kind of fall that way perfectly?
It just fell that way. I mean, if it's all crapshoot, right? Like had Uproxx not been expanding their lifestyle section, and if the person who was doing it, Steve Bermucci, had not been there, probably wouldn't have worked out, and I probably would have bought a bar instead. You know what I mean? But the fact that Steve was the exact same age as me, we're both like Pacific Northwest boys, we have this shared experience, and it just clicked on a personality level. And we had, already kind of a common language that we could speak because of that. It just was the perfect sort of storm, right? And so, when I look at my writing career up to that point, I theoretically have been trained to be a very efficient storyteller because script writing is all about efficiency. It's all about all lean, no fat. And so I all brought that to my writing side when I was doing media, where I tried to be as much lean as possible. Obviously, you need to add some fat in there because you got to hook people in the first paragraph, and you need to put in keywords in the first paragraph that make, SEO work for you when you're talking media and online stuff. So, you have to learn and adjust to that. And of course, that was a learning curve. And luckily, our SEO managers at Uproxx were very giving and willing to spend that time for all of us to succeed. And then, again, applying my service industry, once you told me once, generally I did it from then on and tried to do it to dial it in as quickly as possible so that you wouldn't have to tell me again. But we're all human, like, you forget things.
Yeah.
And I would have Post-it notes all over my computer screen like anybody else to remind me of, like all the details. But, then it eventually becomes your language, right? And it just becomes a passive knowledge that you have and you just do it.
Yeah. And I like what you said about, the process of writing, at least online, being to lean. It has to have some fat, right? So not everybody. A lot of restaurants have, filet on the menu, and filet has almost no fat to it. And when treated appropriately, it can be one of the best steaks you've ever had. And when treated poorly, it can be one of the worst. I think writing is the same way, where, you can overcook it and it's going to be awful. And,
Yeah,
go ahead.
And look, man, like, online media is about making money at the end of the day. And so the repetition is real.
Yeah.
Like, you end up writing about the same things over and over again, every quarter, every, half year, et cetera. You're doing a repost and, because it was successful, and you got to find a way to, keep the numbers up, because that's a reality of it. Right. And so, there are things that I would write about where I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm telling people again what a bourbon is for the 10th time in 5 years. But people click because new people click, and new people are coming in all the time. And you kind of have to remind yourself that, somebody that read your review of, Wild Turkey 101 5 years ago doesn't mean they remember it. And there's a whole new set of people that are coming into it that aren't going to find that review because it's from 5 years ago.
Yeah, and because I live in the circles of the whiskey snobs who already know all of those things. And so we're like, scroll past that thing. And we often forget, like, everybody else isn't us. They don't constantly live in the space where they have, the recipe to bourbon tattooed on their arm, where they know exactly what it is.
The bubble is real, man. Like, and I learned this luckily working in bars is, and I can assure you, like, every bar, you want about 10% to be your regulars who are ride or die, who come in every Friday night with their wife or their date or whatever, or come in. Like, we had a guy at Victoria Bar. He was a pretty big sports broadcaster in Germany. And he'd come in at Friday night at 9 p.m. when he got off work. He'd have one beer at the end of the bar, not speak to anyone, put down the €5 for the beer plus tip, and walk out like clockwork. And that's, those are the people who have, like, the recipe for bourbon tattooed on their arms. And those people are important. Absolutely. Like, we made sure his beer was sitting there at 9:01 when he walked in. And, he didn't want to talk to anybody, which is great because he'd been talking all day about whatever, sports. And he had his beer and he went home, and I'm sure that was his thing. But the 90% of the other people in that bar, they were there because they read about it. And they heard that, oh, old fashions are cool again. What's an old fashioned? I'm going to go get an old fashioned. Or, they wanted a dirty martini for the first time, and then they sipped it and hated it because they never had a dirty martini before. And they don't realize that's mostly olive brine. And they think that you've done it wrong because, why would you serve them something that doesn't taste good? And it's like, patience. And so learning that patience through being in that bar scene where people just, you realize that, 80 to 90% of the people in this world, in the world of whiskey, in the world of film, in the world of music, whatever, have no idea what the details are, have no idea what the passion is, because it's passive. They get off work, they want to drink, maybe two, and they're going home to do something else. There's very few of us who are in this world, whether it be making the spirits, whether it be selling the spirits, whether it be mixing the spirits. We are the minority of the minority, because there are plenty of people who are working in bars who have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to swear. There are plenty of people making whiskey or making gin that have no idea what they're doing. They're just, winging it. And sometimes they hit a home run, and most times they strike out. And there's just as many people selling this stuff that are just selling something. Then tomorrow they're going to be selling vacuum cleaners or medical supplies or paper. Like, seriously, like, I know people who have come in to sell booze and then gone on to sell something else because it was just a job. And, they're not going to give a shit about the barrel, the recipe, the grains, where they come from. They're not here for that. They're here to make their commission and go home. And, that's all fine. I'm not, decrying anybody. I'm not decrying the bartenders who don't learn anything about booze. Everybody needs a job, man. And so by all means, pour whiskey and do your thing. But the people in that 10%, us who are, live and die and breathe this shit, need to remember that we're the minority, and
Yeah.
not to make everyone else feel bad when they don't know that, rye has to be 51% rye grain. And what is a rye grain and blah, blah, blah. It's like, yes, we care, but also it's okay if you
Not
don't
everybody
know.
else does. And that is
Yeah.
a perfully fine place to
Yeah.
be,
If
to
they're
not care about that.
if they're paying money for a drink, I don't care what you do. I mean, I remember clearly because we had some pretty high end bottles, and there was this at Victoria Bar, these guys would come in, and it was like 4, maybe 5 guys from a Chinese company. I can't remember which one now. They told me one night, but it was just years ago. And they would get a bottle of uh, Alexander brandy. Like it's a 1,500 bottle on the shelf, so we're probably charging them $5,000 for it. And they wanted bottles of Coke, and they would take that bottle, pour it over ice, fill the glass up with Coke, and have a great time, finish their bottle, and go out and do whatever they're going to do. And we had a bartender in there, and they were like, how could you do that with that beautiful, amazing brandy? And my boss was like, you know, fuck what they do with it. They bought it. They can pour it down the drain for all I care.
Yep.
They bought it. Let them have their fun.
It's going to all make the same piss.
Yeah. And it's also like, do what you want to do, right? Like, enjoy your drink, your food, your film, your music, the way you enjoy it. And don't let anybody tell you that it's wrong.
Just because I'm precious about it doesn't mean you have to be. And
yeah,
you got the benefit, or maybe the detriment, of working in the types of bars where you're often going to find yourself as an educator as well, right? Because our local bar here that, sells a whole lot of whiskey and Cokes and LITs, those folks are, pouring well and doing speed pours, and their job is a volume game, and they crank it out. You go into a place where you used to work, where, some finer places, and you get a person who orders their first dirty martini, and you're going to end up being like, hey, yeah, because you want them to be happy. You want to make sure your tip comes through at the end, right? And them disliking a drink could result in you not making money. And so, you have to educate a little bit too.
Yeah, and also you want the person to have a good experience, right? Yep. Like there's a certain, like the bar world I come from, it's less like it wasn't volume at all. And so, if it takes 20 minutes to make you a correct drink, it's going to take 20 minutes before you get that drink, because we want it to be right and we want you to enjoy it. And you're like also in the high-end cocktail scene, like there's a very deep level of control to make sure you don't get too drunk as well. And so that's why things often take a lot longer. It's not because, we're slow or don't know what we're doing. It's because these are, often they're diluted, of course. So you're looking at something that's anywhere from 7 to 20% alcohol in the glass, unless you're talking about a Manhattan, then you're looking at, dilution rate. You're pushing maybe 25% alcohol in the glass. You're going to get drunk pretty quick, especially if the ABV on the whiskey you ordered is above 50%. You're going to drink even faster. That means we're going to serve you that slower. That means we're going to come take your reorder slower, because you're going to have 3 and be done. And that's fine. But also, we don't want you getting in a fight in our bathrooms or throwing up on the front of the, on the sidewalk. So, there's a lot of nuance into how people drink. And that's sort of what I bring into this as well, where it's like, we have a barrel strength product that's 58, 59%, depending on the rye or the bourbon. And it's the sort of thing where it's like, this is like you pour one over a nice block of ice and you enjoy it. And, that's kind of the point of our whiskey is we're not, this isn't a rail whiskey. We're bringing to market a whiskey that is for people who want a slow sip with a cigar or with a meal or what have you, and enjoy it in that way. And the sort of knowing your audience and knowing what you're doing, I think, is an important aspect of the whole system.
Yeah, and I mean, you're at least from my understanding of what you guys are doing, you're in the premium market, right? Which is probably a really great play. Say really great. The spirits market is the spirits market, but the premium market seems to be a place where it is still maybe holding on a little better than the volume side of the market.
Absolutely.
That you mentioned that you guys are getting ready to kind of launch into all of these other markets. Like you've got several international markets, several new markets nationally. You've been around for a couple of years with Blackwood specifically, but you didn't immediately jump out there. So tell me a little bit about the process of identifying where you want to go, because you could have easily come in and said, all right, now we're just go to all the markets right now, but there's probably a volume strategy or a liquid volume strategy that you have to make sure is ready to go for those markets. There's an intentionality of market, I'm sure,
Yeah.
of like what makes sense for us to be in. Give me a little bit
Absolutely.
about that process, maybe.
So as a non-distilling producer, it's when they started out, excuse me, when they started out in 2020, 2021, it was a completely different market, completely different world. Barrel prices were peaking at a extraordinary price for the sort of product we were using. And, there was everybody thought there was going to be sunshine and rainbows forever. I don't know why they did that, but what's been a benefit is over the last 2 years, oil prices have been dropping considerably, especially for the product we need for our product, the whiskey we need for our product. And so that has allowed us to sort of lower prices about 20% from just when I've been on board because barrel prices are lower. So one of the things that we've been able to do in that respect is move more into the bar scene and the restaurant scene because now our core product is $79.99 MSRP, whereas before 2024 our core product was a barrel strength and its MSRP was a $154.99. Those are vastly different prices in the spirits industry, and so recognizing like where that price point belongs is the first key, right? So for me, coming from the service industry and the food and bar scene on the higher end levels, so like Michelin stars, World 50 Best, Gold Malone, all that, I've sort of focused our marketing on that. So we become a partner with World's 50 Best for their North America restaurants program. We focus primarily on those bar, hotel, and restaurant accounts in big name markets that we're in. And then we secondarily focus on Michelin starred restaurants, hotel lobby bars for like W and Satai and Conrad and things like that. And kind of keep it into place where, you walk into the Turnberry Marriott in Miami and people are going to Bourbon Steak and they're ordering $1,000 pours of Japanese whiskey. So they're not going to care about paying $40 at Blackwood Manhattan with our rye. Like it's just not going to be. And that's the sort of market we focus on, right? That's not to say we're not at Liquor Barn in Kentucky or, at Winthrop Liquor in Tampa. We're still in those places and you can still buy, the toasted 105 bourbon and rye, our proof down version for anywhere from $79 to $85, depending on the market you're in. Or you can find a barrel strength for anywhere from, 140 to 150, depending on the market you're in. It's all still there, because that's the reality of what we're in. But our focus for moving product is having a sort of pathway towards a consumer who cares deeply about the food and drink they consume, and price isn't necessarily an issue. Now, if you were going to do a volume play right now, you could probably do that pretty well, given that the price of barrels have bottomed out. Like you can get pretty good 4-year-old Kentucky bourbon for $850 a barrel, which is almost cost. But good luck fighting Suntory and Pernod and Diageo in that world because they're ruthless. And even better luck doing it abroad because, you walk into any high-end bar or restaurant in London and Sazerac owns the American whiskey market, period. Like you will see an American whiskey list with 10 or 12 Sazerac products and maybe one Pernod or Diageo product because they just own that market, right? And you have to accept that. And so when you look at where you can enter into the industry and where you can sort of prosper and grow, you have to find the places where those big, huge, conglomerates don't have a stranglehold on everything, or where people care deeply about whiskey and want more American whiskey and, don't get it. The reason that we're going to expand into places like Prague and Berlin, Paris and Copenhagen is because they think top end American whiskey is Maker's Mark and Turkey 101 and Rittenhouse, all of which are perfectly fine. But you can't go into $1,000 a night hotel in Rome and go to their bar and get an old fashioned and pay 30 euros for it and it has Makers in it. Yep. Like that's ridiculous, especially when it's sitting on the shelf next to a 30-year-old Talisker or a 25-year-old Suntory that actually does cost that actually does have that value. American whiskey has sort of done itself a disservice, especially abroad, of not sending out enough of its higher end luxury stuff because they're too worried that the people aren't going to pay for it. It was like, well, dude, if they're paying $1,000 a pour for a 30-year-old Suntory at the Hotel Eden in Rome, they're going to pay $100 a pour for an amazing American whiskey as well.
Right.
Like they just are. because you got to get the bartenders to talk about it. And if you get the bartenders on your side, the price won't matter.
Yeah, that's the sort of hidden skill of a good, well qualified bartender, is that they are effectively a salesperson as well. I've seen a lot of
1
folks
million,
that
yes.
started behind a bar and are now a national brand rep for XYZ, whiskey or spirits brand in general, because
Yeah.
they're in a similar place. At least a lot of them are in a similar place where they're more concerned about the flavor and the intentionality of it than maybe what's on the label, right? And if
Yeah.
you can bring them a high quality product that is new and maybe niche, that it gives them one more tool in their belt to talk about. And I think that the intent to take some of these into, specifically, you mentioned, a upscale hotel restaurant, putting a beverage in there. It's a really smart strategy. So, kudos to you, because you're reaching people who are willing to spend that money, but they're also traveling there from somewhere else, likely.
Yeah.
Right. And so they're going to take that same want back home with them. And if it happens to be in a place that is a Diageo stronghold, they can still try to pull that product to them from some other place. And so,
Yeah. Well, and it's sort of, you have to think about who are your gatekeepers going to be, right? And for a lot of people, the best gatekeepers are on YouTube, on Instagram, on Forbes. Those are great gatekeepers for a certain set of, price points. And they do a fantastic job and it's wonderful. But like, our gatekeepers tend to be chefs and bartenders, because they're the people who, like you said, they're sales too, but also they're taste makers, right? Like, if you are on a menu in a Thomas Keller restaurant as an American whiskey, people pay attention, and that's your gatekeeper, right? If you're selling a $40 bourbon, I would be going hard in the paint on Instagram and YouTube, because a lot of people who watch those particular feeds, not all, but a lot, that's sort of their price range, is that $30 to $90 price range. That's the sweet spot. That's not saying that they don't also buy $250 bottles at Christmas and for celebrations. They absolutely do. But it's also short form, tends to be, and it also is, the price point tends to be lower. That's just the reality of it. And again, nothing wrong with that. Whereas, we have a product that's in the 90 to 200 price range. We need our gatekeepers to be taste makers at the end of the day in food and bev across the board, less than just bev. Because nobody, like, you can pair, a Knob Creek, standard Knob Creek 9-year-old with, any food you want by far. But people aren't going to be pairing that with a tasting menu at a Michelin-starred restaurant. They're going to be pairing that, at their favorite local spot, right? And that's great to know their place. Beam knows that, Suntory knows that, and that's what they do. And so you just apply that, then, okay, well, where do I need to apply?
Yeah. And, it just kind of being in and around the YouTube social media influencer gatekeepers, that's a real noisy channel. There's a lot of folks talking into it, and their opinions change very quickly, right? You get in YouTube or Instagram or wherever, you're going to get maybe a day, maybe 2 days, where when you send out your press release, and that's another place that's real susceptible to press releases, where it's just like, we're turning out the exact same information over and over and over again. And, I even got wrapped up in that a couple of years ago, where I would just take let's make an infographic out of this and just post that, right? That's it. But it's not tasting notes. It doesn't replace that connection. Whereas in a high-end restaurant, or even just an intentional restaurant, I've got a restaurant, a little ways from us. It's not a Michelin star, but the chef curates her menu, changes it every couple of months based off of what's available locally. Fantastic food, and is very intentional about what beverages she's going to put with it. I'm going to pay attention to that for much longer than maybe, what that guy from TikTok said about whiskey yesterday, right? That's going to be in and out.
And look, man, they're dealing with a churn, right? Like, I think YouTube, to be monetized, you have to post at least once a week, and so on and so forth. And Instagram has its rules as well, where you have to do a certain amount of reels and a certain amount of posts per week. And I had the same thing when I was at Uproxx, man. Like, every day I had to turn in at least, one article. Like, I had a minimum, and I had to get a certain amount of views. That's the reality of the situation, right? And when you're in that reality, man, like, the first 24, 36, maybe 48 hours are the big ones. And then sometimes you get lucky and something goes viral for a week, 2 weeks. Sometimes I had things that lasted for 3 weeks. Amazing. Right. Everybody celebrated and popped corks and said, okay, now do it again. And
Yep.
again, I'm not talking out of school or shit here. That's just the reality
Yeah.
of the churn. And so when you have that churn, you get lost really easily. So that's why we focus a bit more on podcasts where we can have long form conversations, and then really focus on bar people, food people
Yeah.
who are there, who, when a waiter comes up to the table and, hey, do you want a nightcap? We have this awesome, we have this awesome whiskey from Kentucky. It's toasted, blah, blah, blah. And they don't even have to say the price. And the pour one, or maybe pour two or pour four, those are the people we need talking about the whiskey. Because again, we're also not that big. Like I mentioned before, like, we're a pretty small crew. We have distribution in, half a dozen, working towards 10 states. We're not sending out 10,000 cases. We're sending out 1,000 cases, maybe 2,000 cases, right? So we don't need to be everywhere. We don't need everyone talking about us across the whole whiskey sphere. It's always lovely when people do talk about us, and we're greatly appreciative of anything anybody says about us. But it's also, we're clear about whose hands the whiskey needs to be in, and it's not everybody's, because it's not for everybody. This is the whiskey we like. We hope you like it too. That's sort of our vibe.
I like that because it's a little bit counterculture, right? Like is, we're not for everyone, but we're for someone, and we're going to intentionally lean into that. Kind of being everywhere, being, everything to everybody. You got to have a huge liquid inventory to be able to achieve that. And it's going to end up like, and you've mentioned Maker's Mark a number of times, and I've got a bunch of Maker's Mark products, and I appreciate what they do.
So do I.
But that's a cruise ship. It's really hard to turn. It's really hard to innovate. It's really hard to do a whole lot of things. Whereas smaller brands or NDPs or craft, you guys can pivot and you can make your decisions, and you can be intentional about what market you go to and
innovate. We
yes.
can do stuff. And so and look, man, let's, be, clearly honest, like Beam and Makers and Turkey, and, they've had 100 years, realistically, 100 years to cultivate multi-generational brand devotion. And there's no taking that away. And I've done thousands of tastings at this point, and hundreds of tastings with Blackwood. And, people are devoted to those brands. People love Beam. People love Makers. And yeah, they're going to like to take a sip of your whiskey, and maybe they'll order one on a birthday or an anniversary or holiday at a bar, but they're buying that Makers when they come in that store. That's what they're there for. And you hope, hey, and the best case scenario, they buy one of yours as well as a special gift. I'm saying that for Blackwood specifically because of our price point. And that's a great day. And I'm glad that person bought that. But, I know they're coming back next week for that bottle of Makers. And that's great. That's good. And so for us, you have to come to the hard truth that we're not going to change that at all, ever. But, if we do get into the fact that, oh, well, it's my uncle's birthday next week, I'm going to get them this because I know he likes good whiskey. That's it. That's great. That's a success for us. And it's the sort of thing where then that does build up over time, of course, but also we're not trying to take away, your love for old granddad. We're not trying to take away your love for, turkey. Like, love it. You should love it. I mean, if, your palate loves that, it's part of your heritage, enjoy it. If you want a specialty something, we got you covered, right? And I think a lot of people forget that. They want to be the next, Beam or Evan Williams and it's like, that's a hill I don't think I'm willing to die on.
It's a big hill to climb, right? Because you're exactly right that this is, 40, 50, 60, 100 years of development gets a brand to that place, and surviving a whole lot of real shit times, right? Like there's a lot of real bad things that have happened in those times, and they've made it through that. And, I've talked to a lot of craft producers or small end producers and say, what I really want is I want to be able to get 1% of Beam's market and 1% of Diageo's market and 1% of Pernod's whiskey market. And if I can get that 1% from each one of those, we have a hell of a brand because of the volume of sales that exist there. But what I like about brands like you guys from a whiskey aficionado is being able to I like to do tastings for people. I love, kind of having somebody do something. You bring them something familiar, something that Jim Beam product that they really like, or that Maker's product that they really like. And you walk them through, and then you have one on the end that they have no clue what the hell that is, right? And you can usually curate your flavor profiles. They like this, and you can bring in XYZ brand. We'll use Blackwood here. And when they get to the end and they're like, oh, I really like this. I've never heard of this before. That's the part that always kind of like tickles my fancy as a whiskey nerd. It's like, here's a new thing you probably have never had before, but you should have this in consideration because you like this other thing,
And that's sort of that was our POV even before I came on board. And this is what sort of attracted me to Blackwood specifically is when Guinness and Justin were sort of looking at starting a whiskey, they looked at the market and were like, what's missing in the market? And this is back in 2019, 2020, right? What's missing? And, there were a few quality toasted
Hmm.
products on the market already, obviously Michter's being the sort of big one, but all those toasted products were oak forward,
Hmm.
like very, very oak forward, which is fine if that's what your palate likes. Fucking drink it all day, right?
Hmm.
But wasn't out there was utilizing freshly toasted barrels for the toasted wood sugars, that caramelized wood sugar, as opposed to the actual
Hmm.
oak. And so what Blackwood sort of did in its blend and its finishing process, because we use a medium toast, no char 4 and char 2 with medium toast heads that are all brand new. We use them once and they go back to Kelvin cooperage. But what the blend of our bourbon and our rye did is really pushed the palate towards a sweeter, richer, deeper profile that was less oaky and more nostalgic. So
Hmm.
almost more like those vintage pours you get from the old Grandad, the old Weller, the old Fitz from back in the 50s and 60s, where it was caramel forward, it was fruitcake forward, it was sort of Christmas forward, spice wise. And that was missing in the modern toasted market, right? That's not like missing from whiskey. It was just missing from that toasted finish where, again, if you want that oak forward toasted finish, great.
Hmm.
It's there. Go get a Michter's, go get a short barrel. Those are fantastic whiskeys for what they do. And so what we found, especially with our rye, with that medium toast barrel, no char, is those freshly caramelized wood sugars really push, because we're using 7-year-old 95.5 MGP,
Hmm.
which is fairly dry, fairly green herb forward, and fairly black to red pepper dryness, right? It pushes away that dryness and brings a fuller, rounder texture because those caramelized wood sugars they're rounding out agents, right? And so you get less of that dry pepper and it's more like almost like a stewed fruit soaked like holiday spice. It's still barky and still, full seeds, but it's just deeper and a little more viscousy. And it's still a rise. You still get the green. There's still that bit of mint, but it's just a fuller body. And that's what those finishing barrels do, right? And so the key here to my point being is we were finding a place in the market where this could fit, where there wasn't anything sitting there yet. And so being able to do that, we can be like, hey, if you love these vintage whiskeys from the 50s and 60s that are for a lot of people impossible to source or pay for, well, here's a modern version of that you can have. And it's not exactly the same, but we luckily through working with Justin Sloan at Justin's House of Bourbon, like I get to drink a lot of vintage whiskeys.
Hmm.
And, there really is a parallel line between an old Fitz from like 1956 or an old Grandad from 1972 or let's say 68. I was still national, or even, an old national or an old crow from that
Hmm.
era and our whiskey where it's like, oh, okay, there's connective tissue here. The body's similar. It's got the same viscosity. It's got that depth that's a little bit on the caramel stewed fruit side as opposed to the drier side that a lot of toasted whiskeys get towards. And so finding that gap means that it was less about what you said a lot of people try to do. It was like, oh, if I can get 1% of Diageo, oh, if I can get 1% of Beam. It was less about that and more about, oh, I'm going to create
Right.
5% over here, completely divorced from trying to get 1% over here. And so in creating that 5% of a unique, like, hey, here's a one of one, enjoy, you sort of have a little more room for growth. Because guess what? You're not going to get 2% of Diageo. You're not. You might get a half, but you're never going to get 2 or 3.
Hmm.
Whereas over here is like, we may start with what would be an equivalent to 1%, but we can grow that to 5 and 10
Hmm.
as more people come on board because you're creating a culture at the end of the day.
Yeah.
You're creating something new. And luckily we have a deep culture given that we won the Derby in
Hmm.
2019 and the horse on our label is the horse that won the Derby in 2019. So there's real sort of value there in that culture. And we're tied to horse racing pretty deeply. But also, it's, I like to say in tastings, our bourbon is a bourbon for whiskey lovers and our rye is a rye for bourbon lovers.
Hmm.
Because if you like whiskey, you're going to like these because you'll recognize that depth of what we're doing with those freshly toasted barrels from Kelvin. It doesn't mean you have to know the science of it. You just have to enjoy the taste, right? And that's, again, there's a reason those vintage bottles are so beloved. And it's partially, of course, people posture and, how people in this industry are, especially on the consumer end. They like their unicorns and their show off bottles, but it's
Hmm.
also because those are good whiskey. Like an old 1956 Old Fitz is an amazing pour,
Mm-hmm.
and it took me a minute to appreciate the old Granddad and the old Crows from the 60s, but the more I have, the more I'm like, okay, yeah, this is actually shockingly good. Now, to be clear, there's reason for them to get better in the bottle through microoxidation and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So, there's more going on there than
Yeah.
just the difference in how they were made back in the day, which is also hugely important and blah, blah, blah. But we're not a vintage podcast, but it's still there's very few people actually chasing that flavor profile in the market because they're
Mhm.
focused very much on the current palate and not necessarily what got them there.
No, and I mean it's a smart thought process. It's something that I hadn't really kind of put together in my own brain because I've postulated my thoughts on why does vintage whiskey taste different aside from the legitimate oxidization that happens on shelves. I mean, you can dive into barrel science and say, well, the wood they were harvesting for barrels was old growth wood, and all we get now is new growth wood, and the rings are different, the density is different, and how
Yeah.
and weather patterns and all of that. But at the end of the day, we're chasing nostalgia, and nostalgia is a hell of a drug. Like it is one of the best drugs that you can have out there. And if you can find a way to recreate it, I mean, there's money to be made off of it. Like I'm wearing a shirt that is an homage to High Fidelity, and that's just a nostalgia thing, plain old nostalgia thing.
Yeah, man.
You mentioned a couple of your products, and we are getting close to time. What products are you guys? What do you have on the market right now?
So we have 6 core products. The baseline entry point is our Toasted 105 Bourbon and Toasted 105 Rye. So all our products have the same exact process, and I'll quickly walk you through to explain them all. So when we bring in a barrel of whiskey, whether that's our 8-year-old Kentucky Bourbon or our 7-year-old Indiana Rye, instead of what most people do is they bash that into a tank, and then they bring in their finishing barrels and they fill all those up to 53 gallons, let them sit for however long they're going to sit. Then they batch that and they bottle it, right? We don't do that. Every barrel we bring in, we rebarrel 1-to-1 in a new barrel from Kelvin Cooperage. So those new barrels aren't getting filled all the way up. They're getting filled up maybe a half, maybe 2/3. It just depends what's in the barrel to begin with. When it comes to 8 and 7-year-old whiskey, sometimes it is half, sometimes they're full. It just depends. Because there's more space inside that barrel, the activity between the distillate and those freshly toasted wood sugars is more verbose. It's more not verbose. It's more vibrant. And so there's a lot more interaction. So a lot of things are finished a bit more quickly than a longer process where if it was filled. And so we're looking at anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months that we're in those finishing barrels. Now, because we keep everything a single barrel, because of that 1-to-1 rebarreling, our high-end product is our single barrel toasted rye and our single barrel toasted bourbon. That price point's going to come in between $174 and $199, depending on your market, depending on the yield, depending on which barrel it was. And so that's a highly allocated product, largely through high-end retail and barrel clubs, right? And you can get it on the shelf at Justin's House of Bourbon and online at bourbonoutfitter.com for, I think, $199. But that's going to be, we're talking anywhere from 130 bottles to, we had a rye the other day that was 222 bottles. Like it's
impressive. Yeah.
It varies greatly.
Yeah.
And those are always going to be barrel strength, but again, varies greatly. We had a rye that was 210 bottles and it was 50% ABV out of the barrel at barrel strength, right? We had a 60.2% bourbon that was 138 bottles. So there's going to be variation in there. Everything is always hand bottled and everything's. We're able to pull out those gems and put them into a single barrel program. While we're doing our sensory work with all of our barrels, when they're just right, we'll put them into stainless so that they don't over oak, over finish, and we'll sort of create our batches for our barrel strength out of about 9 barrels for the rye and maybe 12, 14 barrels for the bourbon. We're just looking for, notes that build up a batch of whiskey, and they're true small batches given sizes I just said. And then we'll bottle that at barrel strength. Generally speaking, that comes out to about 58 to 59% for both the rye and the bourbon. Now, because we're batching, as I mentioned, we use 3 barrels. So we use a medium toast, no char, char 4 and char 2 with medium toast heads. And we're keeping everything on its side. So it's actually on both heads as it finishes. Medium toast and char 4 are going to be the star of the show in those batches. And the char 2 is going to come in for the funk, unique, like filling in the flavor profile. Very few char 2s go out as single barrels. We're looking at mostly medium toast and char 4s going as single barrels. Anyway, so our barrel strength toasted rye, barrel strength toasted bourbon is going to fall between 134 and 150, again, depending on the market. At the liquor store, right? And that's, again, an allocated product. Like we haven't We haven't done a batch yet this year. We're just finishing off our last batch from 2025
Mm-hmm.
sales wise, because it's one of those things where if you have $140 whiskey, you don't need to make a lot of it every year when you're our size, but we are coming down to the end. So we're going to have to make some more soon. Then our sort of core mainstream product is the toasted 105 rye, toasted 105 bourbon. So that's the exact same process as the barrel strength, same amount of barrels, same toasting, everything, medium toast and char 4 being the star of the show, but we proof it down to 52.5%. And that we went down each proof point and found that 105 was just the sweet spot where we still maintained the density and the full bodiness of the palate and the nose, and just took that little bit of edge off the finish for people who don't seek out barrel strength whiskey, right? And so 52.5, 105 proof was just that spot where we still held on, maintained the integrity of our palate, and just made it a little bit more accessible because, again, done hundreds of tastings with people, and barrel strength is this much of the market, man. Like I know people love it, and it's great, and I have a stag on my shelf that I sip from, and I love Booker's and blah blah blah. But when you get out in the real world, people, and then when you get into bars and restaurants especially, they don't want a lot of barrel strength stuff. They want stuff they can put in a cocktail and not get their clients too drunk or their customers too drunk. And that is a lower proof whiskey, period. So when you look at our toasted 105 rye, toasted 105 bourbon, those are going to come in around the $80 mark, again, depending on which market you're in, which then when you look at a bar, that comes down to wholesale for them. They're looking at like $4.50 for 1.5 ounce pour, which is about $16 to $20 for a pour or a cocktail on their menu, which given, the restaurants and bars we're looking at, that's a normal price, right? And so that's what we sort of back engineered the price so that we would be in that sort of lane for bars and restaurants at that price point. And then we do have a couple things on the horizon. We're going to launch a 12-year age-stated product that is not toasted. And that's going to be our first sort of like age-stated, like trophy sort of release. We're working on a collaboration with a German distiller right now for the world's first German American rye. And, we're always looking at innovation, right? Because in my humble opinion, and this may be proven wrong, but I feel like it's right. A lot of ways our size of whiskey producers are going to survive is through innovation and consistency and innovation. So finding something that's new that people will fall in love with. And again, creating your percentage, not taking away a percentage, right? And so innovation, I think, is going to start pushing things as this slump continues in the American whiskey scene, or the American drinks. Let's face it, it's wine, beer, and spirits are all in a huge slump. It's not just whiskey. Innovation is what's going to drag us out of this. And part of that is looking back. So if you look at beer right now, smoked beer is starting to come back because the process is unique, and smoked malts are making a huge comeback. And it looks like innovation, even though it's, going back in time a bit. But, that's what's going to help pull some beer out because, that's going to be the next thing forward. Same thing in wine. Like, people are refining their palates. New people coming in are already educated because of online media. So they don't need a lot of the lower echelons anymore because people don't really need to go through that as much as they used to in previous generations because they've been on TikTok and IG and YouTube already getting an education. So they can kind of skip to the middle and start from there. And that's hurting a lot of the industry because if you can skip to the middle and start there education wise and taste palate wise, that's cutting a lot of the bottom out, but that's also making more room at the top.
Yeah, no. So, I've still got like 57,000 different questions here. One that kind of
part two,
that without a doubt, but one thing that I thought of, kind of, you mentioned your source of rye, not asking about source of bourbon, but you've got this 8-year Kentucky bourbon that's coming in. Are you still purchasing from the same place over and over again? Or are you amalgamating different Kentucky sources just from like a consistency standpoint?
The consistency wise, it always has to be the same whiskey. So we can't advertise where the bourbon is made. I can tell you it's a 75-21-4 mash bill. You can go to Reddit and figure that out. But we ensure that it's minimum 8 years, always from the same distillery, period. Same with our rye, period. Like it has to stay consistent that way. Where we actually purchase the barrels from changes because there are different barrels come available, and there's brokers out there who have access to different things. And we get sent sheets every other day. Somebody who's got, all these barrels and here's their prices, as I said up top, like we've been lucky enough to lower our prices by, 20, 25% over the last 2 years, simply because barrel prices have decreased significantly. I won't get into the details because I don't want to, make anybody feel bad. It's every crisis is opportunity, man. And, it's the sort of thing where, you can get some amazing, amazing whiskey right now for great prices. And that's only going to get better because guess what? Right. The stuff that was being laid down in 2018, 2019, and the stuff that was laid down in 2020 and 2021. I mean, we're already 5 years out from 2021. Like we're 6 years out from 2020. You look at 2 more years, that 2020 surplus, let's call it, nicely called a surplus instead of a glut. Let's call it, it's going to be 8 years old in, less than 18 months. So buy some 6-year-old now, sit on it for a year and a half. Now you have 8-year-old bourbon, probably from a pretty good producer. Yeah. That's going to be excellent. Put another 18 months on that. You're looking at a 10-year-old barrel. That's going to be superb, like really, really good. And that's not that far out, man. 3.5 years ain't that long.
That's a little bit of what I was getting to, is that we're in a place where a lot of brands like you that are NDPs, the opportunity to purchase 8-year Kentucky bourbon is your menu's only going to get bigger in the next 5 years, because there's probably some that was laid down for brands that are not going to exist anymore. There's some that was laid down from brands that don't have the volume to sell it anymore, and so they need to offload it, and so they may have to take a hit on it.
Yep.
The opportunity to purchase really, really good whiskey is going to be great for people. But then it becomes a continuity or a flavor profile standardization problem of, we've always tasted this way. And now you can be approached with the best 10-year whiskey out there. But if it doesn't taste like what you already have, you have to figure out what to do with it, right? If you're going to, purchase it.
And look at it this way, man, like, millennials came around and they are drinking just as much as every other generation. And Gen Z, man, they're pushing 25 now. They're pushing their mid-20s. They're going to be 30 in 4 short years, 3.5 short years. They're going to start hitting the 30s and they're going to start drinking spirits too. Mm-hmm. They are. That's just what happens every generation. I've been around long enough to remember this cycle over and over and over again of people like losing their shit because, millennials aren't drinking. Gen X isn't drinking. Yeah. Millennials aren't drinking. Gen Z isn't. Like, it'll be fine, guys. They'll turn 30. Worry.
Life will get to them soon enough. And they'll start drinking like the rest of us.
Yeah, they'll turn 30 and suddenly they're going to be buying bottles of whiskey too. Because it's, again, what I think is interesting now though is the education is going so much more quickly thanks to the people on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok, that people are going to start coming into it a bit earlier than previous generations where, it used to be 40s, 50s when people started spending a lot of money. Now it's 30s, 40s. And you're seeing a lot more people in their mid 20s in this business, sort of as consumers, simply because, people are doing the hard work online and, doing the hard work on YouTube, doing the hard work on Instagram, doing the hard work on Forbes and Gear Patrol and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to get the word out there. And look, man, you put too much juice in a barrel, let those barrels sit, start putting your juice in the bottle and sell vodka, and then when people get tired of vodka and they want something better, guess what? That juice that you put in the barrel is going to be ready to be put in a bottle, and they're going to switch over, because that's what happens every time. That's what happened in the 70s. That's what happened in the 90s. That's what happened in the early 2000s. So it's going to be okay.
We've got the history model. I mean, it may pivot slightly, but it won't be enough to kind of have this. We're going to have attrition, right? We're going to have attrition in the whiskey space. Yes. We're going to have attrition in the YouTube space. Thank goodness there's going to be YouTube and TikTok and whatnot. We're going to have a lot less transactional. We're going to have more educational people. So you're right. People will be coming into this in a much more informed place than people were even 10 years ago, right? And I think about some of the premier whiskey channels. I think about, it's Bourbon Night, and they just celebrated 10 years like last year. And that's
incredible.
It's incredible that they've been around that long, but also it feels like it's been longer and it hasn't been. And so we're really talking like 15 years ago, it was websites that were doing all the heavy lifting, right?
Oh yeah.
The Bourboners and the Bourbon Pursuits of the world and people and maybe that comes back around. Are we going to go back to like reading
Substack?
Things? I had a question on here about Substack because as an author, right? You moved into a brand thing because, people weren't reading as much, but now we're all going back to Blogspot. Like Substack is just Blogspot with Twitter attached to it for me.
Exactly. Yeah, at the end of the day, yeah. And it's sort of the thing, like if you have an audience, then leverage that audience and get that Substack money, man. But I think that's what people are going to look for. They look for people they trust to give them substance at the end of the day. That's all it's got to be, right? Like you got to have a valuable opinion that makes sense and doesn't exclude people and be like, hey, I don't like this. Doesn't mean you won't. Like people love Lafroig. I don't. Doesn't mean I don't appreciate the quality of the spirit, like they do amazing work at Lefroy. It's just not for me.
Yeah, and I always appreciated that about your writing and your reviews, and you mentioned it, right? Is you're positioning it not necessarily that you a lot of people's reviews are like, "I don't like this. This is bad." It's more of, "This is what it's made for, and this is who it's made for," and I may or may not be that person, and
Yeah.
that's what's great about it
Yeah.
is not everybody's
And
gonna like everything,
and
but
man,
somebody's gonna like it.
also palates are
Mhm.
always changing,
Yep.
evolving, devolving, etc. Like I've been I've been tasting so much American whiskey over the last 2 years, especially, and I don't really drink that much outside of work
Mhm.
because I'm not going to be tasting 25 barrels
Right.
for blending and then come home and have a whiskey. That's just
Seems
insanity.
terrible.
Yeah, but my palate's shifted dramatically because I really, really have to make an effort to try all the whiskeys I still can because I don't want to get cellar palate while I get
Right.
tuned just to our whiskey. But also, I got a bottle of Lagavulin 16 the other day, and the first two pours were almost overwhelming. Where I was just like, "Am I chewing on cigarettes right now? What is happening?" And it took a minute for my palate to remember what it was, and
Mhm.
I got into it. But like first
Right.
few, I was like,
There was an adjustment period for sure.
yeah, I was like, did someone light a Marlboro Red? Like, what's going on? And
Feels like 1996 all over again.
yeah, right. And it was a good reminder
Mhm.
that none of this is static, right? Whether it's your palate, whether it's the industry, whether whatever, it's always in flux, and there's always corrections, and it's just what is what it is, right? And I got another bottle of Lagavulin just to make sure that my palate doesn't recede again. But
You gotta
you
keep up
know,
with it. It's like a version of exercise or going to the gym or something, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And for like I'm a big sort of a champagne guy as well, but also like I generally, if I'm going to have a drink, it's going to be a vodka, and I'm
Mhm.
a big vodka guy, and I could go on for hours about that. But if you're having vodka most of the time, when you do get one of those big whiskeys, it's like, whoa. But I also like that for work as well, because when I get to work, it makes when we're tasting barrels,
Everything's
it
on a
makes it
limit at
stand.
that.
Yeah, it helps
Yeah.
it stand out more when you don't have this, sort of reframed reference point in your personal life that can then, maybe erroneously frame what you're trying when
Right.
you're trying to work. And so I always found that vodka was a good way to kind of keep things on an even keel so I could really highlight, the whiskey better. But
No,
yeah,
that ton of sense.
anytime. Yeah.
Some time
Well,
and
let's do it over a glass of whiskey next time.
right.
Oh, and many thanks, John, and to your listeners. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want some Blackwood, find me on Instagram at ZTP Whiskey or go to bourbonoutfitter.com. But thank you all for listening, and I hope to talk to you all again.
Thanks for tuning into this episode from the Embellish Pod. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform you're consuming this on. Leave a comment if at all possible. Hit me up on social media on TikTok or Instagram at Embellish Pod, and you can give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can also be found at www.embellishpod.com. Has all of my links, accounts, contact details, and I've recently started doing some writing, a little bit around cocktail development. I'm doing one a month. It's a Substack setup. So if you enjoy that, hop over there and see what I've got going on. Thanks for stopping by.